Okay, we're good.
For those of you who just joined us, we will begin momentarily.
I would like to welcome everyone. We're glad you could join us this evening. My name is Lee Strickland, and I'm the manager at the Governor Charles B. Acot Birthplace State Historic Site. And it's our privilege to be able to bring this program to you as a part of our True Inclusion Initiative. Tonight's moderator for our program is Michelle Lanier, and Michelle is the first person of color to direct the 25 sites, battlefields, and museums of the North Carolina Division of State Historic Sites and Properties. She also served as the founding executive director of North Carolina's African American Heritage Commission. Michelle also uses her Black background as an oral historian and folklore to connect communities around personal narratives and cultural expression, particularly in the classroom, as she has taught for over 2 decades at the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University. Michelle is also an award-winning filmmaker and author. So Michelle, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Lee. It is a pleasure to be with all of you this evening. I want to let everyone know that we're so grateful for the outpouring of support for this event. I would like to thank Lee, the site manager at Acot birthplace, as well as the staff there, particularly Tyler Mink, for all of the work in setting up this important event. When we decided to host this event as close as possible to the anniversary of the Wilmington coup, massacre, uprising, and some would call it a riot, we thought that there would be a strong audience for this, but we had no idea. As of this very moment, we have over 500 people who registered for this event. And as such, we are live streaming on YouTube in addition to joining folks via Zoom. If you do have an interest in sharing questions, we would encourage you to offer up a question in the comment section of our YouTube channel, because we have disabled the chat because of how large our group is today. So I do want to frame us and ground us. It's important for us to recognize that while we are talking about history, we're talking about human lives. These are not just stories. This is trauma that impacted families, communities, generations. I want to share with you a bit of writing from an article that I recently read in the Washington Post, written by the journalist Sydney Trent. The Washington Post article that I'm referring to was published on October 29th of this year. And this is just a small excerpt reflecting on a descendant of one of the survivors of Wilmington 1898 named Cynthia Brown. It reads, Cynthia Brown was about 8 years old when her mother took her to visit her great-grandmother, Athalia, who was in failing health and living in Pennsylvania. As Brown and her brother stood by Athalia's bedside, the old woman, drifting in and out of consciousness, suddenly grabbed Brown's wrist, shouting, quote, "Don't let it happen to you. Run." Brown recalled Athalia screaming this before her mother hurried the children out of the room. "Don't let it happen to you. Run." Years later, when she was a young married woman living in Chicago and raising 3 children, her father would finally tell her about 1898 and make her promise to return to Wilmington to keep the family's history from being forgotten. Athalia's father was William C. Howe, and he had left for work on the docks as a barrel maker on that chilly November morning. Athalia was home when she witnessed a Black neighbor on his way to work being shot to death by white men. Brown's father told her white men were running through the dirt streets, firing as they went. Athalia and her mother and sister, along with other women and children, sprinted to the family's church, St. Stephen AME, to seek refuge. But the white marauders had already positioned themselves in front of the heavy wooden doors. And I will say these are doors that I've spent time in front of and inside of, as has our panelists. The women and their children raced behind the massive brick church east to the wooded Black cemetery. There, the family huddled together with nothing to eat for several days, while others found refuge in nearby swamps. Athalia's words again were, "Don't let it happen to you. Run." And Athalia's father said, "Go back and remember." So it is with that that I welcome you to this commemorative gathering. Our purpose here today is to reflect, to learn, to remember, but also to honor the scholarship of my dear colleague, Lorraine Umfleet, and the artistry and the painstaking creation of filmmaker Christopher Everett. You should see their images on your screen. So I'll start with our formal introduction. Lorraine Umfleet currently works with me at the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. She works to develop outreach and specialty programming projects on behalf of the Secretary's office. Throughout her career in public history, Lorraine has worked with a multitude of sites in a variety of capacities, including the Office of Archives and History, the North Carolina Collection, and Davis Library in Chapel Hill, as well as the Joel Lane Museum House in Raleigh and the Historic Hope Plantation in Windsor in down East North Carolina. Lorraine has served on the board of directors for the North Carolina Museums Council, the North Carolina Digital Heritage Center, the North Carolina Preservation Consortium, the Historic Stagwell Foundation, the Raleigh Heritage Trail, the Bertie County Arts Council, and as the historiographer for the Episcopal Diocese of Eastern North Carolina. I think we might be seeing someone else's screen, Matt, instead of yours. Originally from Bath, North Carolina, Lorraine graduated from UNC Chapel Hill in 1991 with a bachelor's degree in history. She then attended East Carolina University, where she graduated with a master's degree in 1998. Reflecting her personal interest in plantation slavery, her master's thesis was entitled Slavery in the Microcosm, Bertie County, North Carolina, 1790 to 1810. Lorraine has also published the book called A Day of Blood, the 1898 Wilmington Race Riot, based on research for which she was awarded the American Association of State and Local History Award of Merit and their prestigious WOW Award. And that book is available at Acot Birthplace, but also in a variety of places. Chris Everett, award-winning filmmaker, is a Durham-based producer and director of the award-winning documentary film Wilmington on Fire. He's the founder and president of Speller Street Films, North Carolina's premier film production and distribution company, and currently works with Full Frame Documentary Film Festival as the communications manager. His notable awards include Best Local Independent Film from Encore Magazine in 2016 and Best Director First Feature Documentary from Pan-African Film Festival in 2017. Christopher is currently filming his next two documentaries, Wilmington on Fire 2 and Grandmaster, which looks at the legacy of martial arts pioneer Vic Moore. So welcome, Christopher Everett and Lorraine Umfleet, and we are going to begin what I know will be a rich conversation. I would like to share with you that this is personal for so many of us. It's personal for me as well. I do come from the Cape Fear region. My people come from the upper Cape Fear primarily, which is Fayetteville, but that river has a way of impacting all the land that it touches. And I'm a relative of Charles Waddell Chestnut, who did write about Wilmington in 1898. And my grandfather was born in Wilmington in 1930. And I can only imagine that he and his father and mother, my great-grandfather, who was an Episcopal priest in Wilmington, that they were very much aware of the shadow of this catastrophic event. I know that we are in traumatic times for many right now. A lot of folks have lost lives, jobs. We are in a moment of what I call a reckoning that is compelling us to have a beckoning. Everything is being looked at with new eyes, including our historic narratives. But I'm very clear that part of our work as public historians and documentarians is to beckon each other and our audiences closer to look deeper into who we are. So I wanted to just begin with maybe more of a personal question. I'll start with Lorraine. Lorraine, could you share for our audience how you even began to be involved with telling the story of what happened in Wilmington in November of 1898.
Hi, Michelle. Thanks for having me. This is a great opportunity to share the tragedies and triumphs, because there are some triumphs of 1898 with the resiliency that we see in Wilmington today. But the reason I got involved with creating the report and then the book about 1898 goes back to 2003, when I was a research historian in the research branch in the Office of Archives and History. And my research past has always brought me to a place to try to tell the stories of people's whose voices we don't normally hear. The stories of women and the stories of enslaved peoples have always been the place where I've done my best research. And so when the opportunity to join the team to help do the research for the 1898 Wilmington Race Riot Commission report, I was all for it. So in 1998, when the city of Wilmington had centennial observances, the folks in the city came together to talk about what happened. Both races came together, and a general consensus was that we didn't know enough about 1898, and that the narrative we had all heard was one that had been created for the most part by the white perpetrators of the violence. So the Wilmington Race Riot Commission was created by the General Assembly, and our Department of Archives and History, Division of Archives and History, was tasked with assisting the commission in its work. And so for 3 years, I worked with the commissioners to uncover the truths of 1898, and it turned into a 500-page report that we submitted to the General Assembly. I then took the best parts of my research and turned it into the book that you referenced earlier today. I had heard about what happened in Wilmington in 1898 in college, not in high school, certainly not in middle school. And I'm an Eastern North Carolina girl, but I had not heard about it until I went to college. So in a nutshell, that's how I became so intimately familiar with what happened in Wilmington. I finished the report in 2005, the book came out in 2009, and I'm still learning about 1898, because I think this is a narrative that will never have a period at the end of it.
Thank you, Lorraine. I'm going to invite Christopher to join in. Christopher, could you share with our folks how you became inspired to create this documentary film? That we're so grateful that you offered up access to our audience members. We know that we sent out a Vimeo link with the password True Inclusion for people to watch. If you haven't watched it yet, as of today, it is still available for you. But Christopher, could you share how you got involved with this story?
Oh yeah, sure. Originally I'm from Laurinburg, North Carolina. It's near Fayetteville, about 40 minutes from Fayetteville, about an hour and a half from Wilmington, North Carolina as well. So as a kid, I would always go to Wilmington to see my uncle who lived there for years. And he would talk about, the local history about 1898. He didn't know the ins and outs of it, but he just, would research some things wherever he would travel to. He was a traveling nurse. He was an RN. And so he would always, look up like local history and stuff. And so, he would talk about it, when we would go visit him. And then later on down the road, when I went to college, just doing my own research into North Carolina history, I would see some things about it. And then I know when the state commission report, Lorraine came out with her stuff, it was, more out there. And I was like, wow, this is the stuff that my uncle was talking about as a kid, but this is a full in-depth report on it. And so it always intrigued me, just as a kid. And so as I got, older in life and decided to make my own films and wanted to go down this film world, this film path, I decided, let me go ahead and try to do something that's going to be impactful, that's going to make an impact. Especially being from North Carolina, I love the Carolinas, it's my home state, and I always try to promote it the best way I can. And I said, I was living in Georgia at the time when I came up with the concept to do Wilmington on Fire. And I said, let me try to do something on the 1898 massacre. You have the report out, by Lorraine Young Fleet. You have several books that were out. You know, We Have Taken the City and all these other books that have written about it, but no one actually did a full-length feature-length documentary on it. And so I said, you know what? Let me try to do this. And so I reached out to folks. I moved back to North Carolina, reached out to folks like Lorraine Young Fleet and Larry Rennie Thomas, who's in the film, and direct descendants of some of the victims of the 1898 massacre as well. And then I just wanted to pull all these folks together. You know, you have people like Lorraine Young Fleet that, you know, come with the research aspect to it. You have people like Larry Thomas, who's been on the issue for years. He's a local Wilmington person as well. Then you have direct descendants, and then you have activists and people like that. So I wanted to have a good mixture of folks that really just brought their A game. You know, everybody did. And it was so hard to really edit this thing. You know, it could have been like an 10-hour movie, you know, really. Just the wealth of knowledge and all the insight from everyone that was involved in this thing. So that's how I really got started. I really wanted to really put this film on the map, so to speak, and this history, to take it to the next level. I didn't think it was going to do what it's done over the years, but I'm glad to just do my part of promoting this history of the 1898 massacre, not only for the city of Wilmington, but for North Carolina also.
And Chris, you said the first time you had heard about this story was from your uncle growing up.
Yes. Yeah. Like I said, he was he was a history guy, you know, like wherever the town he would go to, he would always study the history, the local history, you know, especially African-American history of that city or town. You know, he traveled everywhere. He's been all over the country, you know. So when he came to Wilmington, he always thought it was something weird about the place. But I guess just how people act and interact with each other. It's gotten better over the years, but he was always intrigued by that and just wanted to learn why. And he said, hey, man, there's a lot of stuff that happened here. You know, the Wilmington Massacre, the stuff that happened with the Wilmington 10. It's a lot of interesting history here. But that's about it, what he would talk about it. And then you had folks like Lorraine, you know, with the report that really, opened the door even wider to the history of this thing.
Thank you, Christopher. I think it's really interesting because when I'm looking at even the energy that you're bringing to the way you speak about your journey as a filmmaker. And, you know, I see that you're energized. I see that there's passion. I see that, you know, you're smiling. And I understand what that smile is about, I think. I understand what that energy is about. You know, I'm also someone who works around public humanities and public history initiatives that seek to speak truth into silences, to bring margin to center, to almost right some injustices around erasure. And it's a bit of a disorienting feeling to hold within your mind because we are talking about trauma. We are talking about violence. We're talking about racial violence, but there is this almost catharsis and this freedom in the telling of it that can even inspire joy, that there's this sense of joy of bringing people together to say, we will tell these stories for those who couldn't. Right. So I just acknowledge that.
Yeah, I have to speak on that. You're absolutely right. Because just being an African-American person, period, you know, it's always been difficult for us to really, you know, not just tell these stories, but once we get them together, whether it's in book format or film format or audio, it's always been very hard for us for the distribution aspect of it. You know what I'm saying? So that's why, you know, I'm always overjoyed when anyone reaches out that want to do a Q&A, that want to do a screening, or when people just hit me up all the time and say, hey, I seen your film on Amazon. So it just shows that just the work that we the whole team put in over the past 8 years of just putting it together and then getting it out there, doing the festival circuit, you know, grinding it out, doing our own screenings, really pushing it out there without any major distribution. So it's always been a challenge, you know, for folks like us to really get these type of things out there. And just the success of the film, and not only just success of the film, but more people becoming aware of the 1898 massacre, because that was the goal. And like, Lorraine was saying earlier, this history is still being researched. There's still more to the story. And I'm just happy just to do my part to really help people and motivate people. Because like I said, folks like Lorraine and Larry, who have been on this grind for years, they inspired me to do the film. And so now I can do the same thing for the next folks that are out here that want to do more research or write books or do plays or art exhibits around this topic. So I'm just trying to do my part. And that's why I'm always excited, to talk about it.
Thank you. And I think it's such a good inspiration to show people that you can interact with these stories that are horrific and take some sort of liberation from it. Lorraine, I want to turn to you. Talk to us about the language we use around this event. There's so many different ways that people talk about this event. And I want you to share some of your analysis of that.
So when I started working on the Wilmington Race Riot Commission's work, the term race riot had been the overarching language to describe what happened in Wilmington. But as I got to get under the skin of what was going on in Wilmington in November 1898, it's so much more than that. And there's a variety of terms that we can use because massacre completely applies. Dozens and dozens and dozens of men died, and no one was held accountable for their murders. We don't know all their names. We'll never know all their names. The other terms we see are coup d'etat. And Wilmington's events were, in fact, as far as I can tell, and other researchers have tried to challenge it, but no one's been successful. This is the only successful coup d'etat in United States history. And that is the overthrow by armed men of a legally elected government. And in the course of the afternoon on November 10th, while people were being murdered in the street, the city government changed hands from the legally elected government to one that was put in place by the perpetrators of the violence. And it was followed up with systemic support of the white supremacy campaign, and those folks stayed in office. So it is the only successful coup in United States history. And it's also a riot, because when you think about what a riot is, it's armed people running amok in the streets and mayhem, and homes and businesses are damaged and things are destroyed. And so, yes, it's a riot, but it's not the riots that our 20th century and 21st century brains think about. So I have to use all of those words to describe what happened in Wilmington, because if we try to use one word to describe Wilmington 1898, it's insufficient, because it's a tragedy. People lost their lives. Families lost husbands, fathers, brothers, fathers, the people who provided the income for the family. People fled their homes and never came back to Wilmington ever again. As a result of the campaign of 1898, statewide, African Americans lost their right to vote in legal ways. And we didn't see African American participation in North Carolina's political sphere until after the Civil Rights Movement got going. So Wilmington has so many implications that we can't use one word to describe everything that happened. It's horrible tragedy. And it's a very scary thing, because political rhetoric turned into murder in the street. And so all of these things have to be considered when we talk about Wilmington in 1898.
Christopher, did you want to share where do you go in terms of language and how you talk about Wilmington 1898? And what kind of decision-making process did you all have with the film?
Just to piggyback on what Lorraine was saying, I pretty much, came into it the same way. It was a massacre. It was a coup d'etat. It was racial terrorism, all of the above, you know what I'm saying? And doing these type of projects, it takes a toll on you because you're dealing with trauma, and especially the stories you hear, especially from direct descendants. Like we had a couple of direct descendants who are the actual grandchildren and great grandchildren of some of those prominent folks in Wilmington that were ran out of town back in the Massacre of 1898. And just hearing those stories, like I know, for example, Dr. Manley, he's the grandson of Alex Manley. So anybody who has seen the film or researched it, the newspaper building that the white mob was standing in front of that was burned down, that was his grandfather's newspaper press. His grandfather was Alex Manley, who owned the Daily Record at the time. But when he shared the stories of when his grandparents first met, when his grandfather, moved to Wilmington and met his grandmother and all those things, just the things that you might not, see in a book or actually see in a film, those intimate personal stories, of just how he was an active member of his church. He did the Bible school stuff at the church, and just all those cool, family histories, and just how a lot of that was destroyed because of the massacre. And then later on down the road, when we start showing the film, other descendants, start coming out and say, yo, I'm a descendant of Alex Manley as well. And I'm in California. We never even knew anything about this. We knew like our grandfather had like a newspaper at the time, but we didn't know that was the reason why they left Wilmington. And so it just opened the door for a lot of other folks that really didn't know their family history all the way. And like folks like that have written books and done films like myself have really opened that door for other families to say, you know what, I'm a descendant as well. My family was from Wilmington. I would hear things like this growing up, but people never really told me the real deal that happened. And then I saw Wilmington on fire, and that's what really opened my eyes. So it was a tough time, just researching and talking to folks and meeting folks and putting the footage together. After doing that, you have to kind of take some time and just do something else, a different type of project. That you can kind of say, let me just do something that's kind of fun, and that's not, dealing with a lot of trauma, But the thing is, I think the good thing about it is that this film has really brought some type of closure to a lot of those families as well that didn't know a lot of why their family had to leave Wilmington or why Wilmington is in the position it's in right now. This film really has opened their eyes for a lot of folks, especially in Wilmington today, to really take action, to really start to say, you know what, I want to take my city back and make it better. And like the article you were reading, I know in the article, it was a guy by the name of Joe Finley. He's a founder of a tech company in Wilmington called Tech Mountain, real close associate of mine. And he mentions in the article that, Wilmington on Fire really inspired him to start doing more things in his community. And I remember when he reached out and came to the screening and said, man, this film really opened my eyes. I want to start doing some things different in the Wilmington community. And I said, hey, that's what this is all about. This is what I wanted to do also, to inspire folks to start taking action in this city and make this city what it once was and what it could have been, if the massacre never happened. So
I really appreciate that analysis in terms of, there were several things that you shared that I want to just highlight. One is the potential for healing, the potential for demystifying histories, not just on a national scale or on a statewide scale, but also in terms of family silences and histories. Those of us who are meaning makers, who want to find creative ways to present research, whether it's through a film, whether it's in an exhibit or at a historic site, I think that's one of the most fulfilling implications of our work, is when we can see those light bulbs go off, when you can connect people to stories that have the power of transforming lives. But you also hit upon something else, which is this work is also, I think, emotionally heavy. There's a way of experiencing what is called secondary trauma. And I think that's for those who are who have joined us on Zoom. A couple of things I just want to say to you is that if you are in this public humanities world, I hope that you are taking some notes from the journeys that Lorraine and Christopher have had, because I do think balance is important. You have to go and kind of release. I remember the last time I was at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and had a chance with some of my colleagues to speak to one of the security guards who spends most days guarding the coffin of Emmett Till. And it's, I think, the only space in the museum where you're not allowed to take photographs. But the security guards are in the presence of grief, outrage, devastation, not just for Emmett Till, but for all of the Emmett Tills, for all of the George Floyds, for all of the Trayvon Martins. And we asked, like, how do you deal with that grief? How do you deal with telling stories of trauma every day? These historic narratives are important, but they can also be extremely heavy. And he said he watches a lot of comedy, and he tries to find ways to experience joy as a balance for that. I also want to say to our folks who have joined us just in the last few minutes on Zoom that we have disabled the chat just because of the numbers that potentially could be joining us. We didn't want to have too much activity in the chat, but if you do want to ask a question, we have colleagues who are looking at our YouTube channel, and feel free to drop a question in the comments section through YouTube where we are live streaming. But Lorraine, I'd like to know if you have anything to add to these concepts of the fact that this work is intense. And I imagine some of your journey of research and even telling the story after the research was, if we can call it, complete. If there's anything you would like to add to what Christopher was just sharing, because I know you've had quite a journey as well.
Yeah, when I first started doing the research, I was just, okay, I'm a historian, let me find the facts. And one of the big things I wanted to do was to put a face, a name, emphasis on, let us understand what the African American community saw, experienced, what it was like before the violence, what it was like after the violence, and try to get a grip on the death tally from 1898. And so I was very much the sanitized historian trying to go through the documents and put things together. But doing that, it took me 3 years to get to the report finished. Very quickly, it quit being a sanitary report, and it became my heart and my life. And I wasn't a conspiracy theorist before I did this research. Now I see conspiracies everywhere. And they were just names on a piece of paper until I started visiting with people in the community and connecting those names to people and finding those stories that Christopher's been talking about. And I worked with the commission closely, and there were people in the commission who were from Wilmington, who had been in Wilmington a long time. And one of the commissioners, sweet woman, and we were talking about some of the victims of 1898, and I shared a preliminary list of some of the names that I had been able to pull out of the historical records. And she found an ancestor that she did not know had been involved, much less had been murdered on the day of the violence. And we just had to have some, time together to, I've helped put a piece of her family record together that she didn't know. And she had to back away from the project for a little while and come to grips with what that meant for her family. And then we kept going, and we send each other Christmas cards, and I see her whenever I can in Wilmington now. But so it's a difficult road to go through to study something like this, just like Christopher had to come to terms with some of the things he was hearing from descendants. Getting back into the historical record and seeing how people wrote about the day of the violence, because unfortunately we don't have a whole lot of written record from the African American perspective. We have more letters, diaries, and journal entries about 1898 from the white perspective than we do the black perspective. And so I have to understand that those white folks are writing about this horrific day with a certain perspective in their mind about what happened and why it happened. And it was difficult to read sometimes how they justified what they thought and how they acted. But my goal was to get that story out there. I've done it, and it's amazing as an historian who rarely expects somebody to read your work after you write something, that this has taken off and has made the impact that it's made on people like Christopher, to get the story out, to get that information out, and to encourage future researchers. I am routinely contacted by graduate students and other journalists and other reporters and folks wanting to do more, to take an avenue that we weren't able to take in the research I did. So it's an unusual place to be as a historian, to have what you did have such an impact. And I'm proud of that impact. And thank you, Christopher. I tell you this every time I see you, but thank you for doing that. So.
Thank you, Lorraine. Christopher, when you think about, as a filmmaker, I'm gonna use some of your language, zooming in on the specific details of the violence that happened. And I know we talk about November 11th, but there was this buildup. Are there parts of that story that are I think most vivid in your imagination, that kind of grab at you? I'm wondering if there are parts of the narrative that, if you forgot everything else, that you cannot forget that part. I'm wondering what grabs you the most when you think about the events of 1898.
I would say just the use of the Gatling gun that was used during the 1898 massacre. That really shocked me. I would see it in certain articles, but reading the newspaper articles and reading people's writings about it, I was like, man, you going around killing people and shooting at folks with pretty much a precursor to the machine gun. And killing African Americans, citizens. These are American citizens, and so I think that was really one of those trying things. And also when African American people fled to go to the cemetery, that was the other thing. And then filming at the cemetery, going there, me and Larry, and during the whole time I was filming, and I would go to Wilmington all the time because it's eventually where I met my wife at the time. So even when I wasn't filming, going there to see her, I even took her to the cemetery, and she grew up in Wilmington. She didn't even know the history of Pine Forest Cemetery, and then I took her there and just told her about the story. This is where African Americans ran and hid during the massacre. And I would go there all the time. And I would always make it a point, anytime I would visit Wilmington, I would go there and just walk around and just look at the grave sites and look for folks, from that I would see in the city directories from 1897 and stuff like that. And also just go to people's houses in the town as well. Just go off to the 1897 city directory and see if those old houses are still there. And so I think those are the two things that really kind of, always would stand out, because whenever I would come down to Wilmington, I would always try to go to those places, when those things happened back then, and just, put myself in that mindset, and also just pay respect, to my ancestors as well.
Thank you for that. Lorraine, I'm sure we have some people who are watching right now who maybe haven't seen the film yet. Maybe they haven't read your book. Would you take us through the basic story of what, for people who haven't heard, the basic story of what happened, so that we can get everyone kind of to a baseline of knowledge before we dig even deeper?
The story of 1898 actually has to begin a little bit further back in history, with the end of Reconstruction, which was the give and take of bringing North Carolina back into the Union after the end of the Civil War, and finding a way to integrate these newly freed African American slaves into American society. And it was a difficult process to do, but it worked to a certain extent. and the best place it worked was Wilmington. And in the political world is where the big story of 1898 begins. So in 1890s, North Carolina, we have two major political parties and a third minor party. We have the Republican Party and the Democratic Party and the Populist Party. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party of 1898 are not the Republican and Democratic parties of 2020. So we have to get that in our minds first. So if I say Democrat or if I say Republican, we need to think about what those parties represented. So the Democratic Party is the party in 1898 that's represented by people who were former Confederate soldiers, people who were potentially farmers, people who were conservative in their outlook when it comes to financial things and social things. And they are also the party of white supremacy. The Republican Party of 1898 is the descendant party of Abraham Lincoln, the man who was our president who freed the slaves in 1863. It was a party of businessmen, white and black, who were progressive in their thought processes about how things go business ways and socially. And then the third party, the smaller populist party, was a subset of the Democratic Party who were mainly farmers who did not feel that the Democratic Party was meeting their needs in an economic framework. And so in the 1894 election, we see that the 1896, excuse me, we see that the Republican Party and the Populist Party merged their voting power together so that they have the ability to vote out the Democratic candidates and get their candidates into office. This combination of their voting power is called fusion. I just told you in just a few short sentences what it takes most of a semester in a class to learn. So I'm necessarily smoothing over a whole lot of stuff. And then by 1898, which is an off-year election, in 1896, Governor Russell is elected governor. He's a Republican governor. And the midterm election in 1898 is one that would seat people at the legislature in Raleigh to run the state of North Carolina and to put representatives in Congress in Washington, D.C. The Democratic Party campaign met in 1898 to set its platform to say, this is the campaign we're going to run this year. And Barnafold Simmons from Eastern North Carolina is the chair of the statewide Democratic Party. Simmons decides that in 1898, the goal was to use the white supremacy platform to intimidate Black voters, keep white voters from voting for the populist ticket and bring them back into the Democratic Party fold and take over control of the legislature in the 1898 election. Then following that in 1900, they do the same campaign and would take not only the control of the state legislature, but also seat a Democratic Party governor in the office in Raleigh. And Wilmington is the largest city in North Carolina at the time. It's 50-50 African-American white. It's got a booming economy. It's the biggest city economically and politically and population rate. And African-Americans in Wilmington are seeing a boom. If you are living in Wilmington, regardless of your race, you're making more than anybody else in North Carolina for your daily and hourly wages. African Americans were entrepreneurial in Wilmington and had more businesses than elsewhere. Students in the African American community had a better education than other places in North Carolina, and African Americans were more likely to own property in Wilmington than anywhere else. So Wilmington became a target of the Democratic Party campaign through a lot of different reasons, but the overall deciding factor was that Wilmington's place in North Carolina needed to be an example. And if the Democratic Party couldn't take Wilmington, they weren't going to be able to take the rest of the state. So there was a lot of focus in Wilmington in the campaign. The campaign turns vicious, and there's a lot of activity focused in the white supremacy platform. There are people traveling around the state giving speeches. The red shirts come into play, which is a different form in 1898 of what we call the KKK. They were wearing bright red shirts. They weren't covering their heads. They were riding in daylight. they were intimidating white voters who voted Republican and African-American voters who would have voted for the Republican ticket. And so everything was being done with an eye to making sure that the November 8th election went for the Democratic Party. And in Wilmington, things got out of hand, things got very tense. There was violence before the election. No one was killed, but there was a lot of roughing up of people by the red shirts. And on November 8th, the Democratic Party won every candidate that it had elected or had up for election. November 10th, the folks in Wilmington had come off of its victory and wanted to continue the process. Because in Wilmington, we had an African American and white coalition running the city government. And the decision was made that the folks who had just won the Democratic Party campaign for the state couldn't abide by having Black men still serving in office running the city of Wilmington. So on November 10th, the things got out of hand because the white leadership had made demands, and those demands were to be Alex Manley, this editor that Chris spoke about. Alex Manley needs to leave the city. He needs to stop writing his paper. We want the Board of Aldermen and the mayor to resign. We want to make sure that white men are in control of the city. Shots start flying through the streets after Alex Manley's building is burned on the Wilmington Record building was burned. And then around 11 o'clock, shots start flying. People run and flee to the swamps and to the cemeteries. By the end of the day, we've had a coup d'etat where the city government was overthrown. We have as many as 60 to 80 men in the streets who have been shot and killed. Scores more fled, never to come back. So the city, in a matter of a day, moves from a safe place to live, a place where African Americans had a voice and opportunity, to one where they are endangered second-class citizens. And that's not to say Wilmington was a happy place before the violence, but Wilmington was what the New South could have become at the cusp of the 20th century. It all stops for the African American community, and it's still a scar in the city today. And that, in a very small nutshell, is the overview of 1898 Wilmington. It affects the state in large ways and small ways. The Democratic Party wins control of North Carolina. 1899, the legislature comes into session. They start passing laws to reinforce their campaign promises. We have the first segregation of races in train cars as a result of this election. Then in 1900, we have disfranchisement, which removes the vote for African Americans until the mid-20th century. So it's a cascading effect from what happened in Wilmington, the larger state, into the 20th century.
Thank you so much, Lori. That was an extraordinary telling of extremely complicated story. I wanted to do that just to get folks at a baseline of knowledge. Christopher, I want to go back to something that you said earlier that I absolutely feel in my bones. When you go to Wilmington, there are layers of cultures there, but you can feel there is something palpable in the air. And you will hear particularly Black elders upon, meeting them for the first time, they'll say, you know what happened here, right? And they'll say it in a hushed tone as if there could be some sort of persecution just for saying it loudly. I remember going to St. Stephen AME Church that's referenced in the Washington Post article from last month that I read at the beginning of our time together. I've been in that church, and at the very top level of that church, there is a space that almost looks like an ark. Looks like you could put, anything you want up there. It's the huge, it's not an attic, it's like enough space for an entire congregation. And I remember one of the congregants of St. Stephen AME Church said to me that it was built by Black leaders up out of slavery who had the foresight, almost prophetically, that there would be the potential that their parishioners would need a safe haven, and that space at the upper level was designed with the intention that you could potentially bring people up to the higher level to hide if need be. And you heard me share how some folks went fleeing for the church to hide, but then were prevented from accessing the church by armed white men. There's a phrase that I'm hearing a lot lately, or a word that I think applies to some of the energy that one might feel in Wilmington: gaslighting. Gaslighting is a phrase I'm hearing a lot. It comes from this play that came out in 1938, and then it was adapted into a film in 1944, and it was called Gaslight. And it's kind of this horror story of this man who manipulates his wife's mental state by slowly but surely lowering the gas light so that the house gets dimmer and dimmer. And when she notices it and says, "Is it dark in here to you?" And he goes, "No, are you okay? You must not be well." And he makes it darker and darker and darker, constantly denying what he's doing, until the point where he does drive her mad with that behavior. And that's where we get the phrase gaslighting from. And I feel that part of what has happened in Wilmington, and part of what's so powerful about your work, Lorraine, and your work, Christopher, is that for generations, there are African Americans who kind of feel like, we think we believe these stories that we've heard from generation to generation, but maybe my aunt was crazy. Maybe grandma was exaggerating. Maybe my great grandfather, was just senile, and it couldn't have been that bad. They could not have slept in the cemetery. They could not have been, in the swamp seeking safe haven. They couldn't have been bringing the progenitor of a machine gun on, a wagon down the streets, shooting people in the streets. This couldn't happen in the United States of America. A coup? No. And so I think there's been a bit of gaslighting in, like, no, we don't talk about that. Oh, it didn't happen. Let's ignore it. Let's pretend it didn't happen. And then when we have people like you who are brave enough to say, it did, and here are the documents, and here are the narratives, and here are the oral histories and the records that all come together to tell the story, I think there's this collective kind of like, oh, everything grandmother said, great grandmother said was actually true. So I don't know if you all want to speak to that, but there is a heaviness, and I see that almost this like waves of awakening that are happening for people. Christopher, did you want to talk about that? You speak to a lot of different people for this film.
Oh yeah. I totally agree with you. I know one brother, when we were doing just early filming, just getting stuff going. You see the picture in the film. It's of one of the African American police officers. Black folks were police officers back then, before the massacre happened. But that picture was given to us by a brother that I knew in Wilmington. It was actually his great grandfather. And the thing is, as a kid, his parents and folks like his relatives would always try to tell him about him, about his ancestor and how he was a Black police officer. And when the massacre happened, they stripped him, and kicked him off the force. And he was that didn't happen and stuff like that. So they would try to tell him the history and try to pass the history down to him. But he said as he got older and saw that this stuff that they were saying was true the whole time, his grandmother had died off, and like a lot of those elders were long and gone. And he was like, man, I wish I would have sat down and listened to them. And all he had to give, really, he said, "Chris, I wish I could be in this film and give you some information, but I can't. All I got is this old picture of him. And I also still have the Billy Club as well that he had back in the day, that he had. And I think he still has his old uniform as well. He still has it. And he said, man, you can use whatever you need to really get this story out there. But I should have listened, when I was coming up, to my elders, but I just didn't believe them." And so that actually inspired me to say, you know what, I got to get the story done and get it out there. And it also inspired me to only to finish this project and get it out there, but also start documenting my own family history as well. And I was just in Laurinburg not too long ago, going through my grandfather's old pictures, and stuff like that, and talking to him and my grandmother about how they met, and just pulling out the old photo album. And I haven't looked at these pictures since I was a kid, and so it just really made me start doing the same thing, of really start documenting, our history and our stories, so they can be preserved. And it goes back to what Lorraine was saying earlier. That's why it's so hard to find anything from the African-American side about the 1898 massacre as well. And I said, you know what? I can't really contribute to the problem. I got to go ahead and start documenting as well. So even my own stuff, I've been preserving the journey I've been going on. I got like some of the very first ticket stubs when we did Wilmington on Fire. I got everything, every article I've been in, because you never know, down the road when I'm long and gone, somebody might want to tell a story about how I even did this film or something. So I want to make sure it's there, it's documented, so whoever else, 100 years later might want to do a film on me or about the 1898 massacre or something, they can have it, So I think that's just my little, 2 cents about it.
No, I think it's really important. There are stories that my grandmother used to share, and she's now an ancestor. And I for years, I thought, those are exaggerations. That did not happen that way. And I wouldn't shut her down, but I remember thinking, okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration. And because of the benefit of so much digitization having happened, I'm finding death records, and I'm finding more details about, deeds and military records and pension records that are helping me to go, oh my goodness, every single thing my grandmother told me is now lining up. So for those of you who have elders in your family, I think take Christopher's wisdom and my experience to heart, that it's so important to record in whatever way you can, from writing it to audio to video, or record these stories, because they absolutely fill in, these oral histories fill in the void where the written record doesn't give us the fullest possible story. In terms of telling the fullest possible story, one of the things I really appreciate about the film, Christopher, is you talk to so many different kinds of people. You use a tool that I love to use in curation and in film called multivocality. You had multiple voices, many different ways of seeing things, people from all different walks of life. Can you talk to us about your journey of even getting to meet some of these people, descendants, experts, Yes.
I would say, the first person, when I went down this journey, the first person I reached out to was Larry Rennie Thomas. We watched the film. He's the Rastafarian brother. He's at the end of the film, doing the poem. But he was the first person I reached out. I went on YouTube and I saw him on YouTube actually interviewing Dr. Lewin Manley, Alex Manley's grandson. And I reached out to him and just told him what I was trying to do. He sent me a couple of his books, and then, we got up a few times, talked it over, and stuff like that. I said, man, this is what I want to do. I need your help. And he said, all right. So he hooked me up with Dr. Lewin Manley, Faye Chaplin, and other folks. Hooked me up with Professor Sandy Darity as well. Because Larry has been working with a lot of these folks for years, because his organization actually seeks out direct descendants of the victims of the 1898 massacre. So it was nothing for him just to get on the phone and talk to Dr. Manley and say, hey, I got this young man right here. He's trying to do a film about the 1898 massacre. Do you want to be involved? And everyone, wanted to get down and do this and be a part of it. And so he was one of the first people I reached out to. And then he hooked me up with Kent Chatfield, who's in the film. And then also I said, you know what? I got to get someone who actually done this work on a bigger scale. And then I reached out to Lorraine Unfleet as well, because she's done the actual official state report. So I had to get her on there as well. So I wanted to have a mixture of folks like Lorraine, independent researchers like Kent Chatfield, people like Larry Thomas, who was from Wilmington and been more like a grassroots activist type of brother, and also his work with direct descendants as well. Then we have people like Umar Johnson, he's controversial now, but back then he wasn't a controversial, guy. He was actually making sense. But we had him, and then we had other local folks that were activists as well. And it was just a good blend of people. And I kind of got the concept to do it like that. It was pretty much based off of Tariq Nasheed's Hidden Colors series, where he had all these people together, like all these people that we would see on like underground lecture tapes and stuff like that, but have them all in one film together. And I was like, man, that's a cool idea. I might can do that with Wilmington on Fire, get a good mixture of people together. Everyone is on the same page. Everyone knows the history. They're all bringing, their own personality, their own style, but the message is still clear and it's still the same. Like I said, going through, we probably interviewed everybody for about 3 to 4 hours. And so going through all this footage was just amazing. It was like going to college for free. Like I said, sitting down with Lorraine and Professor Darity, these great minds and researchers, even me and my old camera guy, we talk about it still to this day. Like we actually enjoyed sitting down and talking to folks because just getting all this knowledge for free. Like I said, it's just like you're going to Duke University or something, or Harvard, from some of the best, historians and researchers out there. So it was a privilege, to really be in the room and meet all these people, because if I never did this film, I probably would have even never met a lot of these folks, so doing the film not only, helped me get the story out, but also introduced me, to a lot of people that I probably would have never met if I never did this film.
Thank you so much. I do have some questions from our audience that I do want to turn to, but I have one more. I actually have many more questions, but one that I feel like I have to ask, because we are being hosted by the governor, Acot, historic site. Lorraine, I would like for you to help our audience to understand the connections between Acot, and I would love for you to put him in context of, what were his contributions to this historic tragedy, but also how did he connect to others who may have been his peers who were a part of this, because I know he did not work in isolation.
Okay. Acot is, by 1898, already a mover and a shaker in the Democratic Party. And he is at the table when the Democratic Party convention is pulled together in Raleigh to set the platform for 1898. And although he's not the chair of the Democratic Party, he's a good operative for Furnifold Simmons to do the work of getting the election campaign going. And the election the season began with the Democratic Party saying that rule by white men of the state was promised to be the primary focus of the platform. So Acot is on board as a member of the Speakers Bureau, because you have to remember, in 1898, we don't have TV, we don't have Twitter, we don't have CNN. And so the way that voters can get to see and know and hear the candidates is for them to travel around the state. And most often they would travel by train and stop at train stations in every little hamlet along the way and give stump speeches to inflame the voters to support their candidacy and to get the white supremacy platform across to them. And Acot was a very good speaker, and he's seen it, speaking engagements all up and down the state. He did at least 20 in 2.5 months. And those are just the ones I was able to quickly document in the lead up to the election in November. He is seen, Josephus Daniels, who's the editor of the Raleigh News and Observer, is the voice of the Democratic campaign in print. And Daniels makes it very clear he is very proud of what the Democratic Party is doing. He is all for the white supremacy campaign, and he writes glowing articles both in his paper and his autobiography about Acot. And he said in one of his articles that when Acot declared Wilmington the center of the white supremacy movement early in the campaign, that the cause of Wilmington became part of the cause of the campaign. And by May 1898, the speech that Acot gave in Laurinburg, Daniels said it sounded the keynote of the white supremacy campaign. So, Christopher, right in your hometown, we have Charles Brantley Acot making a speech and getting the white supremacy platform out there on behalf of the Democratic Party. Acot was responsible for organizing speaking engagements, not just for himself, but others on the circuit. He was a good speaker, and he got his listeners on board with his campaign. And because he was so well known as a result of the 1898 campaign, he is rewarded. Those are Daniel's words and other folks who were his colleagues, that he was rewarded with the governor's office in 1900 for his hard work in 1898. He came into the governor's office right after that suffrage amendment was passed in 1899. That suffrage amendment said, and this is a brief overview of that suffrage amendment, but it required voters to pass a literacy test in order to be qualified to vote. However, if you couldn't pass the literacy test, but you also had an ancestor or yourself eligible to vote in 1867, then you were still eligible to vote in upcoming elections if you couldn't pass the literacy test. That clause expired in 1908. So when Acot comes into office, he's known as the education governor. And I would argue, and there's lots of reasons why Acot wanted to support education for North Carolinians, but one political reason is that by 1908, white voters were going to need to pass the literacy test in order to be able to vote. And we wanted to make sure that those white voters were pro-Democratic Party voters. So the type of education that was given in white schools was to educate them to be good Democratic voters. And the education given in Black schools was to teach African Americans how to be good tradespeople and good domestic workers. And it was an unequal system of education for African American students after 1900, after 1898. And we can look at school records. I spent hours and hours and hours going through the New Hanover County school records to see that prior to 1898, even though there was a disparity in funding for white schools and Black schools, it wasn't that big. But later, it becomes much more disparate, that white schools were getting better funding, white schools were getting better textbooks, the quality of the textbooks were better, and African American schools were consistently underfunded. So all of this goes into the story of who Acot was. He was a member of the Democratic Party ruling elite alongside Furnival Simmons, Moorhead, who also becomes a governor. We also have Josephus Daniels in the mix, and 2 or 3 other leading men who became governors later. It's just 1898 in the campaign sets the stage for Democratic Party rule for North Carolina well into the 20th century. And Acot is just a part of that piece of the puzzle that explains the larger impact of this white supremacy platform.
And I would even dig underneath the I know it can be very disorienting because we have people, I'm watching that people have joined us later. So I just want to reiterate something that you said earlier, Lorraine. When we're saying the words Democrat and Republican in the context of 1898, they are not, and we really want to emphasize that, they are not directly, they are not reflective of the current political realities of those parties. So I want to dig into the phrase white supremacy. I have read not all, but many of Governor Acot's writings and speeches. And I would say that not only was he white supremacist, he truly believed that white people were the superior race, but in that moment he believed that, and it needed that concept needed to be defended. He was not shy about it, he was unapologetic.
Well, that's the case for most of the men of that period. You see that consistently across the board. And they were proud of what they did, and they were feeling very justified in overthrowing not only the government in Wilmington, but the government in North Carolina. These men had seen that white voices, in their opinion, had been minimized, and that white interests had been jeopardized, and particularly those of the upper class, because everything that was done by this populist Republican fusion of 1890 was one that gave more of an egalitarian government across the state. And for Wilmingtonians, you can see that what it meant was more streets were paved, more firehouses were being built, more emphasis given to the greater good of the city, not just focused on those white elite corners of the city and the downtown business district. And that was something to consider when the white upper class leadership in Wilmington couldn't control whether the dredges got done in the river versus a firehouse being built in a predominantly Black community. And the white leadership who created this successful white supremacy platform across the state of North Carolina, they wanted that control. And 1898 is about who had control and who wanted control, and how far were they willing to go to get that control. And in Wilmington, it was murder in the street. There were other parts of North Carolina that had similar instances of potential violence, but it never materialized in the way that it happened in Wilmington. And many times people like Acot and Daniels and other leaders from across the state would say, you know what happened in Wilmington? Do you want that to happen here? Because it can't. And you need to know your place and stay there. So it's a very big catalyst for North Carolina.
Thank you. And I want to just also, when you say, that the Governor Acot and Josephus Daniels and others, too many others were a part of this kind of cadre of this white supremacist elitist philosophy. One thing I want to call out is I am a big proponent of debunking the concept of someone being a man of their time, because one of the things that I love about the history of North Carolina is that we see that there were white, anti-racist, and abolitionist and liberatory and progressive traditions throughout the history of the state of North Carolina. So at the time that there were slave owners in North Carolina who owned hundreds of people, there were also abolitionists. At the time that there were people who were white supremacists, there were others who were interested in partnering with African Americans for racial uplift, working to help support the creation of schools like Shaw University, and also even, of course, white folks who were attempting to marry into Black communities. And so he was a man of his choosing. He certainly had, but he was not alone. I don't know if you want to say anything else before we can shift. I have a few questions for you, Christopher, that have come from the audience. One question is, I'm going to kind of combine two questions. So Christopher, there's a question on how long it took you to do the film from first coming up with the idea to completion. That's the first question. And then the second question is wanting to hear more about Wilmington on Fire 2 and what you're up to with that project.
Okay, yeah, sure. Well, Wilmington on Fire, the first one, it took about, I would say, November 2011 to about, I would say, fall of 2013 to shoot everything. But, this is my first film, and I forgot you needed money to do post-production. So I kind of went on like a year and a half, just grind of trying to find some post-production funds. But luckily, out the blue, an NBA player by the name of David West reaches out, and he was actually following the project because of just the promotion I was doing just while filming it. And he wanted to get involved and wanted to help get it out. And so he wanted to partner up by, providing the necessary funds to finish post-production. And so that summer of 2015, we were able to wrap up post. And with the timeline of premiering at the Coup Festival in Wilmington, North Carolina. And I wanted to really do that because Coup is big and also it's Wilmington. And I was like, you know what? And also Coup usually happens during the week of like November 10th anyway. So I was like, man, this is perfect. To really get the most impact, we have to debut and premiere at Coup. But I didn't know we were going to end up having about over 600 people coming to the thing, and also have about 300 people on the outside that couldn't get in. It was crazy. And so after that, we did a couple more sold out screenings of about 600 to 700 people in Wilmington. Then we went all over the state with it. And then just all over the country at festivals and doing our own screenings. So it took a good, 4 years to get it all together. And then, some more years of just promoting, and we're still promoting and doing screenings, still now, that's what this is. So the work is still going, it's not just shooting a film, the next work after shooting the film, you have to get it on the road and do screenings and do festivals. So it's been, I say about an 8-year journey, I guess about 3.5 years of filming and editing, and then another 5 years of really getting it out there and promoting it. Wilmington on Fire 2, Chapter 2, we started filming that at the end of 2018, and then we started back again this summer and been filming ever since, the start of the summer. And that's really going to focus on more of Wilmington today and how the 1898 Massacre has really impacted the city today, but also individuals, especially the younger generation, what they're doing to really make the city better and make it what it once was and what it could have been, if the Massacre of 1898 never happened. So it's going to be it's a very different style of film. For one, I'm a better filmmaker than I was, years ago. And also I got a little budget now. Back then I didn't have any budget at all. It was just all, whatever I could get, and we had like a little DSLR camera and that was it. Now we done stepped the game up a little bit. And so as a filmmaker, you always want to grow and learn from your mistakes and get better. And so that's what we're doing. And people can check out the teaser right now if you want. They just go to the Wilmington on Fire Facebook page. You can check out the teaser for part 2, and we're still filming. We're actually going to be doing some filming this weekend. And I'm in Wilmington right now, getting ready to do that type of stuff. So be on the lookout for that. Hopefully, if God's willing and COVID doesn't get any worse, we can premiere in November of 2021. So we'll see.
Thank you so much. We have a comment that says from a gentleman who says, the first I heard of the 1898 Massacre was when I went to the Johnston County Library earlier this year. They had a book sale and I bought the book, The Conspiracy of the Secret Nine. We have another question that I'd love to have both of you answer, and I think this might be our last question. The question is, having performed the research for you, Christopher, for Wilmington on Fire, and Lorraine for you for the report and A Day of Blood, do you all have wisdom for combating disinformation around elections to prevent further tragedy and or mend our divided communities? So how can we use the story of Wilmington 1898 to help us be vigilant against disinformation, and also how can we use this story as an opportunity for healing and reconnection? So I'm going to let Lorraine, I'd like you to start, and then we'll let Christopher follow that, and then I'll make some closing remarks.
So I approach things firstly as a skeptic. When I see a letter, a document, an article in a newspaper, I look at those things with a critical eye. What's the source? What's the content? What's the goal of this document, and what is it trying to do, or how is it trying to make me feel as a reader? And when I was compiling my research on 1898, I would pull all of these sources from letters from people who participated in the planning of things in 1898. So these are white upper class Democratic Party leaders. I would pull journals from people who were recording their personal thoughts. They never thought anybody would ever read, but somebody put it in an archive and I found it. And then I was looking at the newspaper articles that Josephus Daniels would publish, and no, his goal was to get people inflamed and angry and out to vote. And once you put all of these different things together and they're describing a similar event, then you start to see a pattern of maybe what's true, what's contrived, what's not true, and what's not being said. Because many times if you're looking at something, it's what's not being said is as important as what is being said in some of these documents and records. So being a critical thinker is a skill that everyone should create for themselves. Because if we're not a critical thinker, we'll believe everything that comes across our Facebook feed as true. And we'll all start to think that snakes have legs. So that, I think, is the most important thing. And I started to think like an attorney when I started doing my research, because I wanted to have a critical mass of evidence about this event. And I wanted to try to sculpt a narrative of who was in the street at 11 o'clock on November 10th at shooting at George, Henry, and William Mouzon, and all these other men who I now know were murdered that day, and try to create a strong story. So being that critical thinker at its very root has got to be something that everybody thinks about. And trust your sources.
Thank you. Christopher, I'd actually like to ask you a different question. We have a couple of questions coming in, and I think these are going to be the last two. Thank you all for putting your questions in YouTube. So first, Christopher, this is a question for you. First of all, Kara Dedman, I'm going to shout her out. She works at the state capitol and also one of our colleagues. This is for, I think, Lorraine and Christopher. Thank you for your work. Christopher, could you talk about attempts, successful or not, that the city of Wilmington has made to reckon with this history? How do the interviewees feel about these attempts? How has Wilmington, the city of Wilmington, tried to deal with this history, and how do the interviewees feel about the attempts?
Well, you know, they've done several things. One, and anyone can go to Wilmington now. You have the 1898 Memorial Park. That's one that's there now. But outside of that, you know, you've had a couple of markers that have came up. I know recently, I think last year, they put up a marker that has, you know, Wilmington coup, and, you know, redescribes the massacre for what it was, a massacre and a coup. And then, you know, you have, you know, things like that. You know, now I think recently, even a few weeks ago, you know, for November 10th, that week of the 10th, the city of Wilmington really, you know, started sharing 1898 events that were going on in the town, in the city, on social media, and really pushing that out for anyone who had any type of 1898 event, you know, to really push and promote it. But outside of that, you know, there's not really anything been done by the city of Wilmington. But you know, a lot of the folks that we've talked to in the community really feels like there needs to be more. Definitely, you know, it's, you know, you can't really, you know, be satisfied for just those little things. And that's why I wanted to come back and do part two, to really talk about those issues that the community, what they would like to see and want to see done. And also what they're trying to do about it as well, instead of just sitting by waiting. You know, what are these young folks trying to do about it, and really, you know, make their mark and make an impact to really force the city to really deal with this head on. But like I said, the city really hasn't done anything, but I've seen a lot of individuals start to do things. Like I've seen, ever since the film has been out, I've seen teachers start to teach this history more in their classes, in their classrooms. I've even been invited to quite a few schools in Wilmington to show the film. They've been teaching it now. The principals are in support of it. I'm seeing more parents starting to teach a lot of this stuff at home now, you know, by showing the film and getting books on it. I told you about the guy earlier, Joe Finley. He's a guy, a businessman in Wilmington. He's used the film to not only get other businesses in Wilmington to really start helping out, but he's also trying to make a difference. Also recently, just the other week, the big tech company in Wilmington, Encino, they recently invited me on to do a lunch and learn with them. And then they did a drive-through screening at their company headquarters. And so they also are going to start using the film for educational purposes within their own company. So those are the things that I'm seeing in Wilmington, not the city in general, the government, but it's been the individuals, the businesses and just individuals that have been, you know, putting this thing on their backs and their shoulders to say, you know what, we're not going to wait around for the government. You know, the government's not going to probably do anything, but we can do something as citizens. And then eventually the government and the city of Wilmington will come around as well. So that's what's really going on right now.
Well, I want to speak as someone who is a civic servant. Part of what we're doing here today as an extension of state government is to, I think, take our roles very seriously in terms of something that I call true inclusion. For us in historic sites, true inclusion means that we expand the table of memory, that we seek to tell the stories that have been silenced, that we seek to bring the marginalized stories to center. So I'm excited to have a role in being an arm of state government in a way that I think can foster healing and wholeness. That sign that you talked about that has been kind of, you know, recalibrated, comes out of our Office of Archives and History at the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. We do have a comment or a question that I'll respond to as I make my closing remarks. Does the state recognize the massacre as a coup d'etat? And if so, are we living in a 122-year-old false government? The state does recognize that this is a coup d'etat. And one of the things that Lorraine Umfleet has been really clear about is that, to our knowledge, it's the only successful coup that has happened in the United States. And the state does recognize it. And I would say that we aren't living in 122 years of false government, but we are living in the legacies of Wilmington, 1898. And part of, to me, one of the functions of a democracy is the opportunity to correct. Every time we vote, every time we register people, every time we seek to stand up against voter suppression, this is an opportunity to correct. And many of the people who are descendants of those who were victimized by Wilmington 1898 have been spending their, almost every waking moment seeking justice, equity, more voice, and definitely working to increase the right for people to have ease of access to the voting process. So I do want to thank you, Lorraine, not only for your work, but for being with us tonight. I know that you've been doing this a lot, and I know November is very busy for you. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Christopher, for joining us as well on behalf of Acot, Birthplace State Historic Site, and the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. I'm very grateful for the work that you're doing. I want to thank everyone who joined us. I especially want to thank Lee Strickland, who said, we have to do this, who's the site manager at Acot. I know some people are thinking, a site that's named for Governor Acot wants to do a program like this? Yes, because we're committed to telling the whole story. We're committed to true inclusion. I also want to thank Tyler Mink, Matt Provancha, Stacy Montevello for all of your help behind the scenes. This new digital realm is challenging, and they have given it their all. And I just want to express gratitude. We hope that everyone stays healthy and safe, and you can visit all of our historic sites. We have ways that we work to keep our staff and our visitors healthy. So please do come visit us, and thank you everyone for joining us. Take good care.